St. Gallen is the most eastern province in Switzerland. It's also the most populated, with over 180,000 residents. But you'd never know it from traveling around the countryside. Forests, grazing cows, rolling hills that look like someone comes out every night and dusts them off. Neatness is very important in Switzerland. To get a sense that there are actually more people than cows, you need to go into the area's capital city. The capital city of St. Gallen is called St. Gallen, which can be confusing, but very efficient. Like New York, New York. But St. Gallen was into efficiency for at least 1,000 years before anyone heard of New York. And they are presently in the process of celebrating that history. It all started in 612 when a wandering Irish monk by the name of Gallus was passing through eastern Switzerland and decided that this was his kind of neighborhood. It was cold, it was barren, it was gray, it was miserable, and that was just what he was looking for. Because in those days, in order to have great accommodations in the afterlife, you had to have miserable accommodations in this one. Over the years, Gallus developed a substantial following, and after his death, a Benedictine abbey was founded on the spot where he died. Gallus was sainted, and within 200 years, the abbey became one of the most powerful monasteries in Europe. It was the most important educational institution north of the Alps. The room where the abbey scribes worked became one of the most famous libraries. It was built in 1758 and contains more than 150,000 books from and about the Middle Ages. The books are arranged according to different scientific fields of study. It's still a working library for scholars studying the Middle Ages. This library is considered to be the cradle of the German language. It was here that Latin was first translated and written in the German dialect. Before the St. Gallen translations, German was spoken but not written. The environment inside the abbey might have been magnificent, but the surroundings outside were still pretty rough. At 700 meters above sea level, the only crops that grew well were flax and hemp, which the monks used to weave linen. They also taught the local population how to weave. During the early 1700s, the St. Gallen weavers saw how Turkish hand embroiderers decorated the silks that were being sold in Europe, and they decided to embroider the fabrics made in St. Gallen. By the end of the 1700s, over 40,000 embroiderers were working in eastern Switzerland. And by the middle of the 1800s, the town of St. Gallen had become the world epicenter for embroidery, which it still is. There are 3 great embroidery houses in St. Gallen, and each has a different approach to the art. This is Forsterone. Tobias Forster is the CEO.
The company was founded by my grandfather in 1904. And at that time, many embroidery companies were founded in St. Gallen. And because the embroidery industry was the most important export industry of all of Switzerland, more important than watches or chocolate or what have you. So at that time, when you wanted to get rich quickly, you had to go to St. Gallen and found an embroidery company. Then, after the First World War, business became difficult. Fashion changed. So many companies went bankrupt. And then in the 30s, my father came into the business, and he thought this is not going to happen to me again. And he thought I have to have an instrument in order to keep embroideries in fashion all the time. And he did it, building up a very close relationship with the best designers of the world. And the best designers of the world at that time were the couture designers in Paris.
During the 1860s, craftsmen in Switzerland developed the mechanized loom. It utilized a combination of continuously threaded needles and a shuttle containing a bobbin of thread. The shuttle was shaped like the hull of a boat. In the Swiss-German language, the word for little boat is Schiffli, and the mechanism became famous as the Schiffli machine. When the first large embroidery machines were built in St. Gallen, these elaborate fabrics were suddenly available at a much lower price than ever before. Today, about 65% of embroidered fabrics are produced for generally affordable items, particularly lingerie. About 35% of St. Gallen's embroidery goes to the fashion industry for the creation of haute couture and prêt-à-porter clothing by the great designers. But I was surprised to find out that almost all of the embroidery designs are developed not by the fashion houses that design the clothing, but by the embroidery companies. Martin Leuthold is the creative director of the Jakob Schlepfer Company, which is one of the most important embroidery houses in the world. Do you go to famous designers and ask them what they want for next season?
Well, if you go to the designer and ask them what they need for next season, they say something nice, something beautiful, something innovative.
Very detailed.
Yes.
Something nice.
If fashion have seen something once, it's old. Fashion people, they have to touch and they have to see the colors, they have to feel the fabric, and then they choose or they like it or don't like it. We do about 2,500 designs a year. Each 3 months we have a new collection.
What are some of these that are here?
Well, there are different fabrics. This is something special we developed. It's a 5-layer silk metallic fabric. It's just woven together on the selvage, and all 5 layers are loose. And then overprinted with an inkjet print, and you get this kind of light feeling.
So it's more than really embroidery, it's a creation of different fabrics.
Well, we use all materials, from feathers to wood to plastic sequins, silk, cotton, polyester. This is feathers on a cotton organdy. Cotton organdy is also a very specialized fabric from St. Gallen. The last 200 years we do cotton like organza, like silk.
Is that done by hand?
Yes.
So each of
one
these
is glued on by hand.
We've been embroidering fabric for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians and the Babylonians embroidered their robes. During the Middle Ages, ecclesiastical clothing was embroidered. And by the early 1300s, successful merchants were into embroidered clothing because it was an unmistakable sign of their wealth. One of the great inspirations for new designs are the embroidery house libraries. Bischoff Textile is the 3rd great embroidery house in St. Gallen, and it is famous for its textile library. Max Hungerbuehler is the CEO.
It's a Chinese embroidery. I've personally worked with this by coloring up new designs because the color combinations are so unusual. It's something different made in pure silk. Here is a Japanese embroidery, very, very colorful. You see the background is red, and then at least 12 to 15 colors are being used for the embroidery, a piece of art.
How long would it take somebody to do just one of those flowers?
I would estimate it would take between 2 and 3 hours to do this with the changing of the yarns and everything.
So we're looking at hundreds of hours just to make that piece.
Absolutely.
I see.
This library is an old collection of embroideries, but also of books, fashion books. Designers come here and they work with the different books that we have here. Let me just show you one. You have different designs of old dresses. Surely today a stylist or a designer will not make something like that again, but it inspires him, and he also sees how embroideries can be adapted on the different dresses. This is a present that we got from customers in Spain. The reason is Bischoff Textil AG was founded in 1927, and Mr. Bischoff went for his first trip to sell embroideries to Spain, and he made many friends down there because it became quite a good market even during those tough times, and one of the friends then gave him this as a present. This is embroidery, hand embroidery, metallic embroidery, a beautiful piece.
I hope the bulls appreciate what they went through.
I could imagine. They didn't so much, but the public and probably the torero that was wearing it, he also was quite attractive to lots of women.
St. Gallen's 1,000-year history in textiles eventually led to the development of its own couture fashion house. It's called Acris. It was founded in 1922 by Alice Crimler Schock. Her children had grown up and gone off on their own. She rechanneled her energy into designing aprons that she sold to her friends. Eventually, the demand for her work developed into a small manufacturing company. When her children entered the business, it became a producer of high-quality ready-to-wear for the great designers in Paris. In 1982, Alice's grandson Albert was brought in to design their own label under the Acris name.
Designing for us, it starts always with fabrics. I cannot design or sketch without having fabric in my hands, because a fabric always gives a lot to tell you what is possible and what is not possible. When I have done the fabric quality, I think of a color. And then I do a sketch, I design what I want to do.
The drawing and the fabric are discussed with the tailor and developed into a three-dimensional model.
She does a pattern, and she does a first silhouette which we put on a mannequin, and then we start speaking. It has to be more narrow, it has to be more straight. I want the shoulders larger, less large. It goes to all these details, and if we are good, we need 2-3 fittings. If we are not so good, we need 7, 8, 9 fittings until to get to the final result. Still not right.
Albert is always mindful of St. Gallen's history in embroidery. His signature clothes use both classic embroidery and modern fabrics. 25% of the manufacturing process for an Acris garment still requires highly specialized handwork. His designs are sold in major department stores and Acris shops that have been set up in cities throughout the world. In recognition of its 1,000-year history in the textile business, St. Gallen has organized a celebration called Schnittpunkt. It's a word that's used in the textile industry and means cutting point, but it has a second meaning. It means crossroads, the spot where you choose your future. As part of the celebration, the work of Acris is on display at the Textile Museum.
This is the Spring-Summer collection 2006, this year's summer collection, and here I was inspired by a photo shoot of Helmut Newton, of Angelica Houston, she did in 1973 for Italian Vogue. She's wearing a nude-colored, very light chiffon blouse, and I was inspired through all the season by this picture, and it made me develop a lot of extremely light fabrics, but also I only stayed in these nudes and beiges and whites. I felt this was right for this summer. Here I treated our leather, the beautiful leather quality, and we punched it holes to make it light. And look how delicate this all work out for a leather jacket.
So these dark spots are holes?
Yes, for sure.
It looks like it's part of the pattern.
This was the piece of the collection. It was the most photographed piece of my fall-winter collection, and once more it's out of St. Gallen embroidery. You see, it's a tulle embroidery with raw wool on, and also this trapeze coat is fully reversible. It was also an archive-inspired pattern, but I love it. It has so much modernity in it, you know.
As part of Schnittpunkt, the St. Gallen Art Museum installed an exhibition called Lifestyle, which is a collection of works that deal with the relationship between art and fashion. The curator is Conrad Bitterly. What's this piece about?
This is a video installation by the South African artist Candice Brights, showing 30 Madonna imitators or Madonna fans singing a whole album by the famous artist, the Immaculate Collection.
What's it mean?
Madonna is kind of the role model for an identity that constantly changes, from the Latino to the Domina to the material girl. So you have 30 imitators who all try to get into that identity, to imitate this role model, but at the same time they each have their own individuality that they can't hide.
Interesting. How do I get out of here?
Not for quite a while. You have to sing along for 70 minutes.
I'll do the best I can. Holiday. Celebrate.
This is a piece by the Geneva-based artist Sylvie Fleury, and it shows a car in a way...
It's a real car?
It's a real car, but in a way that you don't drive it anymore. It's crashed, obviously, and it has a color that doesn't quite fit the colors that you usually see on street. It's a lipstick color, Givenchy 601. So what it does, it kind of melds two different worlds, the world of racing, of male obsession, with the world of fashion, of makeup, through the color of the Givenchy makeup and lipsticks.
Just down the street is the St. Gallen Historical Museum, which has an exhibition called Dress Code. The works present the idea that a dress contains a coded message. There's an extraordinary video by Yves Sussman. It presents an imaginary vision of the people surrounding the 17th century Spanish painter Velázquez while he was at work. A video by Hussein Chilean presents furniture that can be turned into clothing. Jacqueline Hassink is a photographer with a special interest in the private fitting rooms used by the great designers for their most important clients. This series presents some of those rooms. It's difficult to be in Switzerland and not think about Swiss watches. You get the feeling that each street has at least one store selling them, and the selection is rather magnificent. While I was in St. Gallen, I noticed that many of the people involved with fashion, art, and technology wore watches made by a company called IWC, which stands for the International Watch Company. The company was founded by F.A. Jones, an American engineer and watchmaker who came to Switzerland with a plan to use American engineering technology and Swiss craftsmanship to produce watch parts for the American market. Originally, he wanted to manufacture his watches in the French-speaking part of Switzerland near Geneva, but the French would have none of his modern American ideas and basically told him to get lost. Well, while he was getting lost in the Swiss mountains, he heard about a new hydroelectric plant in eastern Switzerland that was producing low-cost energy, just what Jones needed to power his watchmaking equipment. And so in 1868, he set up IWC. Technical innovation has always been an essential part of the company's operation. In 1885, they introduced the first digital watch with teeny windows for the hours and minutes. During the 1930s, they turned their attention to the needs of early aviators. Pilots needed a watch that would function precisely at extreme temperatures, could withstand pressure changes, would not be affected by magnetic fields, and was easy to read. They adapted their pocket watches and introduced the big pilot's watch with a long strap because the watch was worn over the pilot's flight suit. They still produce the most advanced watches for pilots. In 1985, they introduced the Da Vinci. It was the first wristwatch with a mechanical calendar programmed for 500 years. It proved especially popular with people who had a family history of longevity. Then they started hanging out with the scuba pioneer Jacques Cousteau. The result was a group of watches known as the Aquatimer Chronograph Cousteau Divers. They even make a model that is water resistant to a depth of 2,000 meters. I can't imagine what I would be doing at that depth, and if I was there, why do I need to know what time it is? But you never can tell. Might have a sushi date with a mermaid and not want to be late. The International Watch Company has an impressive history, and they've certainly developed some fantastic technology. And those are certainly major reasons for their popularity in St. Gallen. Most important, they are made here in the German-speaking eastern part of Switzerland and not in the French part, where the original founder was rejected. So there. And on that note, it's time to see what's cooking in St. Gallen. Clearly, its most famous contribution to gastronomy is the St. Gallen bratwurst. Until the middle of the 1800s, sausages were rather coarse in texture, but a technical breakthrough of awesome proportions produced a sausage with a smooth and creamy texture, and soon the St. Gallen bratwurst was born. It's a hot dog that even a dog could love. And when in St. Gallen, the place to get one is Gemperle's. They have their own recipe and produce over 10,000 bratwursts per week. They have the best of the wurst. A St. Gallen bratwurst is made from veal, pork, bacon, and the secret ingredient, which will not be very secret after I tell you, fresh milk. And it's served with a typical Eastern Switzerland roll called a Bürli. For a coffee and a traditional sweet, the place to go is Rogweiler's Cafe and Tea Room. St. Gallen has two great sweets. One is a St. Gallen Spitzen, which means embroidered, and it's actually chocolate with an embroidery pattern on it, both milk and dark. And the other one is a Biber, which is gingerbread, marzipan, gingerbread. It's a marzipan sandwich. And finally, there's the Scherer Chocolate Shop with its handmade specialties. An obvious test of one's willpower. Okay, let's get started. One of those. One of those. One of those. Two of those. Getting the knack of this, huh? One of those. One of those. One of those. One of those. And clearly my willpower is not as strong as I thought it was. For Travels and Traditions, I'm Burt Wolf.
You can watch this program and link to hundreds of other Burt Wolf programs free at burtwolf.com. There's information on how to tour the same places, plus Burt's slightly irreverent take on history and culture. It's all at burtwolf.com.
Over the years, Gallus developed a substantial following, and after his death, a Benedictine abbey was founded on the spot where he died. Gallus was sainted, and within 200 years, the abbey became one of the most powerful monasteries in Europe. It was the most important educational institution north of the Alps. The room where the abbey scribes worked became one of the most famous libraries. It was built in 1758 and contains more than 150,000 books from and about the Middle Ages. The books are arranged according to different scientific fields of study. It's still a working library for scholars. By the end of the 1700s, over 40,000 embroiderers were working in eastern Switzerland. And by the middle of the 1800s, the town of St. Gallen had become the world epicenter for embroidery, which it still is. There are 3 great embroidery houses in St. Gallen, and each has a different approach to the art. This is Forsterone. Tobias Forster is the CEO.
The company was founded by my grandfather in 1904, and at that time many embroidery companies were founded in St. Gallen, and because the embroidery industry was the most important.
Studying the Middle Ages. This library is considered to be the cradle of the German language. It was here that Latin was first translated and written in the German dialect. Before the St. Gallen translations, German was spoken, but not written. The environment inside the abbey might have been magnificent, but the surroundings outside were still pretty rough. At 700 meters above sea level, the only crops that grew well were flax and hemp, which the monks used to weave linen. They also taught the local population how to weave. During the early 1700s, the St. Gallen weavers saw how Turkish hand embroiderers decorated the silks that were being sold in Europe, and they decided to embroider the fabrics made in St. Gallen. Very efficient, like New York, New York. But St. Gallen was into efficiency for at least 1,000 years before anyone heard of New York, and they are presently in the process of celebrating that history. It all started in 612 when a wandering Irish monk by the name of Gallus was passing through eastern Switzerland and decided that this was his kind of neighborhood. It was cold, it was barren, it was gray, it was miserable, and that was just what he was looking for. Because in those days, in order to have great accommodations in the afterlife, you had to have miserable accommodations in this one. St. Gallen is the most eastern province in Switzerland. It's also the most populated, with over 180,000 residents. But you'd never know it from traveling around the countryside. Forests, grazing cows, rolling hills that look like someone comes out every night and dusts them off. Neatness is very important in Switzerland. To get a sense that there are actually more people than cows, you need to go into the area's capital city. The capital city of St. Gallen is called St. Gallen, which can be confusing, but very